All right. So next up, we've got Dr. Jason Lloyd with Nucor. He's going to be giving a presentation on internally redundant members. A version of this, I think you did at World Steel Bridge, and we thought that was an awesome presentation. So I wanted to get him back over here and do it for us here in Texas. So, Dr. Lloyd.
Check, check. All right. Greetings from the greatest steelmaker the world has ever known. Thank you for having me. Oh, yep, thank you. Okay, down is advance. Oh, there's a little bit of a delay. I gotta be patient. Maybe if you're on LinkedIn, maybe you've seen this video. Recently, New York State DOT published a video on their LinkedIn account, and it showed an individual. The camera perspective was from a dash cam on what I'm guessing is probably a crash truck parked in the shoulder next to an interstate or highway. And then in front of that crash truck, you see coming into view of the camera, there's like a utility truck parked, a few feet away. And then you see this individual who I presume is an NYS DOT employee, dressed in his reflective gear, hard hat, and he's kind of peering around the crash truck. Have you seen this video? And moments later, you see panic on this man's face as he jumps out of the way, and out of nowhere, this humongous Ryder rental truck, big box truck, comes crashing into the truck in front of the camera. His hard hat goes flying. I mean, like, it didn't fall off like from his movement. It projected like I don't know what hit it, but this man runs off. The trucks tumble into the side of the road. Incredibly violent scene. Maybe look for that on LinkedIn. It's scary. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I'm opening this with purpose. We're going to talk about how that relates to this as we look at internal redundancy for steel bents specifically. The case study I'm doing is hypothetical. So this actually hasn't been built, although you can see that there are some built up straddle bents that have been built. Okay, so the idea has been in the railway industry for decades. They've understood conceptually that there's damage tolerance in built-up members. Anyone in here seen the Netflix special called Norseman? Oh, really? Wow. Dang. Am I the only guy watching videos online? Okay. Talk about falling flat on this one. It's a parody that makes fun of Viking culture. Okay, I recommend it. Watch a serious Viking show first, and then watch the Norseman, and you'll appreciate the humor. But they have this line that they use in the Norseman all the time. They say, "A plan crazy enough it just might work." Well, that's kind of what I'm proposing here. I'm taking you back to the 1910s, 20s, and 30s and suggesting that built-up construction could be a good approach. And so you might be thinking, you're crazy, Jason. And I'm saying, bear with me. It's crazy enough that it just might work, okay? So for steel bents. So for this hypothetical, I'm going to watch the time, so I'll be peering at my watch every once in a while. I'm using the new guide spec. We're not going to go into the guide spec or the research. That's been talked about ad nauseum, so don't worry. Take a deep breath. It's new material, kind of. And then I'm using, to do some of the analysis, I'm using a spreadsheet tool that we developed in conjunction with the National Steel Bridge Alliance. That spreadsheet tool is available on their website, by the way. You can download that and use it as well. For those of you who are not familiar with the methodology of that guide spec, let me just give you a quick rundown. Here's the basic steps of what you do if you're analyzing an existing structure or doing a new design and evaluating for internal redundancy. So first, there's a screening criteria required. That, of course, is for existing structures. You want to make sure that there's no significant damage of any kind in place that would basically impose on its ability to incur some additional damage in the hypothetical analysis that you're going to run. You're going to check fatigue life in the unfaulted state, and there's some requirements about having fatigue life left in its current state. Okay, unfaulted means current state, nothing's broken. So what we're going to do is a hypothetical analysis where we assume one plate or one angle within the cross-section of that built-up member fails suddenly under brittle fracture. And then we evaluate for strength in that faulted state with one element broken. And then we're going to do a fatigue check again, but this time in the faulted state. Okay, so anytime you hear me say faulted state, I'm referring to that cross-section having one element broken. Okay, and then at the very end, assuming it passes all those checks, we're going to do what we call a special inspection interval calculation. And this again is just meant to say, okay, if we have a redundant member, then arm's length inspection by code is no longer required. So what interval should we be going back to look for a broken component? I borrowed this photo from Ronnie. Thank you, Ronnie. That is not a built-up straddle bend. That's actually a 3-girder straddle bend that's going to be talked about later today. It's already been mentioned by Todd, but it's eye candy for you to look at. So for this concept, just pretty basic design. The steels we use, the holes and bolts we use. Just for your knowledge, I'm including a 1% traffic growth, annual growth model in my fatigue analyses, okay? And 2,000 trucks in a single lane, so pretty busy road. I'm going to use this preliminary concept design. I don't know if this was ever built. I want to say this was a Texas design, but I've kind of lost track of it, honestly. But this is just the concept I'm going to use. So 101-foot span. In this case, we've got 2 cross sections I'm going to analyze. One over at AA that's got 2 cover plates right before the bearing. And then out toward the middle where we've got 3 cover plates. So this is what these cross sections look like. Pretty standard. This meets all the definitions of an internally redundant member in terms of what's bolted and what's welded. So you can weld in the compression zones and still meet the provisions of the guide spec, okay? Trust me, I am not going to step through everything I input into the spreadsheet with you today, okay? That would be torturous for you and me. I realize that your blood sugar levels are getting low as you're 2 hours away from breakfast now. Blood's pooling in your legs. Your oxygen, your brain is starving for oxygen. I'm not going to put you through that, okay? But this is just to give you an idea of what this spreadsheet looks like. You input all the parameters of your member. You insert your loads. I'm using a redundancy 2 load case. For new design, because it's being built to the fracture control plan, we get a little bit of a break on the load factors. So pretty standard loading case. And those are the unfactored moments, if that means anything to you, just so you have that, I guess, in your back pocket. So in this analysis, then what we do is we assume that outer cover plate fractures. Suddenly, you're out there inspecting on a Wednesday afternoon. Everything looks great. You drive home, and unbeknownst to you, that bottom plate fractures, okay? So in that state, we have to analyze, does this remain stable? Does it reestablish equilibrium, redistribute loads within its own cross-section, continue to carry service loads safely until another inspector goes out and finds it, or maybe a passerby, which, by the way, fractures, historically, they're not usually found by inspectors, right? Sometimes they are. You know who are finding most of our fracture events? Yeah, civilians, bird watchers, kayakers, painters. There was a case in Arizona where the painter painted over this ginormous crack, came to the DOT and said, "You want us to caulk that?" Probably not. But this is some of the outputs that we get from the spreadsheet, right? So basically what we're seeing here is we're looking for these green OKs, which means we're passing our strength checks. We're doing a net section fracture check and a gross section yield check. So we're good in this case. We had infinite fatigue life in the unfaulted condition. So our unfaulted fatigue life is good. Okay, so everything's looking good so far for this hypothetical. So here's where we're at in that methodology. We're checking back in here. Screening criteria, of course, it's unbuilt, so it's in pristine condition in cyber world at this point. Infinite life, it passes our strength checks. What about fatigue life in the faulted state? That's our next check. Right, so our effective after fracture net section stress, sorry, I'm pushing too many buttons. 4.8 KSI, So you multiply that by your ratio of your fatigue factors to get, for your infinite life check, 10.5 KSI. Category C is our fatigue detail. And so 10.5 is greater than 10, which means we're in finite life. Does that strike anybody as odd that I'm using category C? The bolted connection, usually category B, right? But you got to remember this is fatigue in the faulted condition. And so what we found in the faulted condition, you lose some of that pretension in your bolts. Very locally, right around the fracture event, you actually have fatigue life more consistent with category C. Okay, so that's why we're using category C here. So once we run that check, 43 years of fatigue life in the faulted condition. It's pretty good, right? And we're concerned about a 2-year inspection cycle, right? So we've got positive fatigue life in the faulted state. This actually, according to the guide spec, meets all of its provisions. It qualifies as an IRM, okay? So the next step then is to calculate our special inspection interval. And again, output, it's my candy. We meet all our checks. Everything's happy. 45 years. Actually, I think I might have messed that up, but this is the updated 45 years. What did I say on the previous screen? 43 years? It's 45. I need to update that one too. I reran these analyses before I came down here, I promise. But ultimately what we get is a special inspection interval of 10 years. Okay, that is the cap on the guide spec. And not to go too in depth because I promised not to focus this on the guide spec itself, but you're capped at 10 years for a special inspection. I'm going to talk about the special inspection next. So what this is saying is, if on that Wednesday we don't find any damage, we go home, and that fracture event happens unbeknownst to us, we have 45 years of remaining fatigue life in that member before another component starts to fatigue crack or crack significantly, okay? That's really what that means. And the recommendation is, because we have 45 years of fatigue life in that faulted condition, it can tolerate damage for a long time. So we're comfortable going back to look for that broken component at a maximum of 10 years, okay? I know already, just based on my experience, that there are some of you in this room who are uncomfortable suggesting that an inspection interval of 10 years is sufficient, because we've been trained to think that 2 years is the inspection interval that we should use. I'm going to challenge you on that, okay? And I hope that you'll stay open-minded here. But does anybody know the research behind the 2-year inspection cycle? There was none, okay? And I'm not saying it was bad. It was excellent. But it was really just a room full of experts with a ton of industry knowledge and wisdom who said 10 years for an arm's length is too long and 1 is maybe too short. Let's do 2. Okay, so my point is, don't get too hung up on the 2-year, okay? Stay with me. Our analysis is showing us that this member can tolerate a broken cover plate, completely severed, carrying service loads safely for 45 years. And what we're suggesting with this process then is that we would go out at least every 10 years and do an arm's length or some version of an in-depth inspection that would be reliable, would allow us to reliably find that broken cover plate and fix it, okay? It's not meant to justify leaving it in service or anything like that. It's just to give us a sense of what our inspection interval should be. Okay, so at both sections, we meet our faulted strength checks. Both cross sections that I analyzed in this hypothetical come out with a 10-year interval. So that leaves the question is, this was a design that I didn't do. I just borrowed it for this hypothetical. And so my mind immediately went to, is there a more economical version of this steel bent that would also meet the provisions of the IRM and work well for us? So I kind of stepped through some case studies here. So this is the baseline one we just looked at. 3 1-inch cover plates at cross-section BB, okay? As we just showed, it met our strength checks, 45 years of life in the faulted condition, 10-year inspection interval. Now, if we follow the pattern that if you're familiar with railway design, you know that they always use a declining plate thickness as you go to the outer cover plates. There's a reason for that, and which is kind of expressed really well here, illustrated here, where we reduce the size of that outer cover plate and then assume it's the one that breaks, right? Because it's experiencing the highest fatigue stress ranges, most likely to crack and break. We're left with more of our cross section once that outer cover plate breaks. So conceptually, very easily, we can understand that we have a lower stress range in that faulted condition, which means our fatigue life goes up and we get infinite life. Okay, so with this scenario, in terms of fabrication costs, I'm not a fabricator. I don't know that there would really be any cost savings between scenario 1 and 2 in fabrication, but we do see some benefit in our faulted state fatigue life, so that's good. If these two cost the same to fabricate, which would you prefer to do? Maybe the second one. A little safer. All right, scenario 3, what if we could eliminate an entire cover plate out in the middle cross section? So what I'm doing here, you're noticing I'm maintaining the same tension zone gauge, 3 inches of tension plate. So what if we did 2 1.5-inch plates? Well, unfortunately, when you eliminate one of those 1.5-inch plates, it doesn't meet strength, so that one's out. It actually missed the gross section yield by just 7%. It was close, okay? How about another scenario? What if we made that outer plate just a little thinner and the inner plate a little bit thicker? Again, following that same concept. Makes a lot of sense. We get good results, but trick question, that actually does not meet the provisions of the IRM guide spec. So in there we've got, what do we call them? Detailing provisions, basically, that limit the size of adjacent members. And the idea there is, 1, limitations on the research that developed the guide spec itself. But number 2, we're basically trying to limit how much dynamic load is transferred between adjacent components in the event of a fracture. And so you don't want a massive member releasing a crazy amount of elastic energy into the adjacent member it's bolted to, potentially causing some kind of problem. I think it's ultra conservative, honestly, based on what we saw in our research, but it is what it is for now. So it's a good thing. Conservative guide specs are good. So that doesn't meet the guide specs, so we actually have to eliminate it. How about one more where we just make it just a little bit thicker on the outside, a little bit thinner on the inside. Now we meet our strength checks when we hypothetically eliminate that outer cover plate. 40 years of fatigue life in the faulted condition still, so that's still really great. Because again, we're maxed out on our inspection interval of 10 years, right? So that's a 4x safety factor on our inspection cycles. So special inspection. For those of you who are familiar with this, it is defined in the Code of Federal Regulations. Basically, it's kind of like the catch-all inspection for an owner. If you have some unique situation, some kind of unique damage or something specific to a bridge that's not really defined by all the generic inspections, you can require a special inspection, which is intended to find some unique scenario under some owner's discretion toward its interval. So the owner basically can say, this is the level of inspection we need to do, and this is how often we need to do it. So the special inspection definition is invoked for IRMs or an arm's length, or again, it's not only the interval, but also the depth of inspection is according to the discretion of the owner. So in this case, traditionally we would call that steel bent NSTM, non-redundant steel tension member, the new FCM term. And in the past, you could max this out at 24 months. There were very rare exceptions where you could extend it to 48, but traditionally pretty much an arm's length inspection at 24 months, sorry. So if we qualify then as an IRM, some of the benefits to the owner is that we can extend that special inspection, replacing the arm's length hands-on inspection at 24-month intervals with potentially something else at an interval as much as 10 years. Now you're still going to go out there and do your safety inspections, make sure your bearings haven't walked off. Those types of things are still going to occur. But you can develop a unique inspection specifically at an interval that gives you a reliable outcome for finding certain types of damage in these members. So in this case, whatever you need to do to find a broken cover plate, not a fatigue crack. Believe it or not, we are terrible at finding fatigue cracks as humans, but we're really good at finding ginormous cracks like a broken plate, okay? So not only does it change the interval, but also changes the reliability of our inspection. So coming back to this photo that I borrowed from Ronnie, just to give us a visual, I want to say this steel bent was in the neighborhood of 90-foot span or something around that ballpark. Does that sound right, Ronnie? 80? So its scale is pretty close. So I guess the question you have to ask yourself, and I'm posing this to you rhetorically for discussion today, is if you had 2 or 3 cover plates on this steel bent, and every 10 years at minimum, you wanted to go out there and find a potentially broken cover plate. The question you'd ask yourself is, how do I need to access this member in order to reliably find that broken cover plate? You might say, well, we need to get into a bucket, out in traffic, and look at arm's length. Or you might say, I could stand at the pier in daylight with binoculars. Maybe that's sufficient. Right? So you can get creative without compromising safety and reliability. Because again, we're not trying to find the same things as we are with FCM inspections. Now, crazy enough, it just might work. I'm going to throw one more idea out there to you. So far, we've been looking at box sections. Todd schooled us this morning on the benefits, the torsional stiffness benefits of a closed box section or partly opened. What did he call it? Pseudo open. Yeah, that's the fancy word. Pseudo open section. What if we had a stack system or maybe even an integral? I don't know. Convince me an integral wouldn't work. I'm not 100% sure yet, but a built-up I section. Okay, so I threw this in here, just hypothetically. These are plate sizes, 35, 4 by 1.5. 3 cover plates. We get the same vertical stiffness that we had with the box, same shear moment capacities. Okay. We meet our strength checks. We have infinite life in the faulted condition. Well, what's interesting about this solution is it's incredibly easy to fabricate compared to a box, especially if you have to paint the interior of that box, and very especially if that box is being welded. So there's some nice benefits here. All right, so considerations. I got to give credit to a prestigious fabricator, I'll say for the moment, who helped me out with some of these numbers. They shall remain unnamed at this point in time, but maybe later we can talk more about that. Help me come up with cost approximations, and then we're going to look at weight, okay? So this is listed kind of like a restaurant review, from least expensive, $1 sign, to most expensive, lots of dollar signs, okay? And if you're like me, I'm only eating at the number ones, but in this case, we're looking at relative cost, fabrication costs for these different box or different steel bent sections. The most economical being the baseline number 1, a fillet welded box, where we presume that the fillet welds are only on the exterior of the webs, which means the fabricator doesn't have to climb inside that box, do all the preheat and welding inside that little oven. Okay. The built-up bolted eye girder, 1 to 2%. If you get to a built-up bolted box girder, you're adding another 15 or so %. And then a CJP welded box is the most expensive. If you take nothing else away from me today, let it be this: don't use CJPs, okay? All right, so we get some economic benefits if you look at a fillet welded box versus a built-up box. What about weight? And that's kind of built into the cost, because the lighter the member, the less materials required. Lesser material doesn't necessarily mean lower fabrication costs, however. So this is an interesting data point too. But again, from the lightest to the heaviest, from 1 to 3. Of course, our eye girder is the lightest, saving us about 10 to 15% over a welded box. And then the built-up box was a little heavier than that. I will say though too, like, these numbers are very preliminary. I didn't optimize these designs. I just went off a pre-existing design. So we could take this a little farther and optimize some of this. Like for example, the eye girder had a very thick web, okay? because I was trying to match shear capacities without having to do a shear analysis. I was just really simplifying this for my own benefit. But it does give us some ideas here. Keep in mind though, these are front costs only. Now we need to consider life cycle costs. And that's where I want to come back to that TxDOT video. Okay. In-service inspections. If you have an NSTM, incredibly expensive, first of all, to perform that inspection. POD changes, that's probability of detection. With an NSTM, we're expected to go out at arm's length and find tiny little fatigue cracks. We're not good at doing that. We have the data to prove it. We're very good at finding cracks that are 5 inches and longer, which would be a broken flange or a cover plate. Okay? And then consider the safety-related aspects of an arm's length inspection. There's an interesting study that was done at Purdue University. We've talked about the greatest universities in Texas. Now we're talking about the greatest university in the universe. And interesting here is that what they found is congested crash rates increased 24x with a queue of 5 minutes or more. What do you think creates queues in traffic? Closing lanes. Traffic patterns change, queues line up. Guess what we do? And then we stick our employees out there, in that traffic, and they're, putting themselves into very dangerous situations, as I was starkly reminded of watching that TxDOT video the other day. So we have to ask ourselves, are we doing it for the right reasons? And maybe is there a better way for us to do this? With what appears to be very marginal upfront costs changes, we can build redundancy into our systems that are able to tolerate damage of during service loads, remain stable and safe, and improve our probability of detection. And what we're really doing is managing risk holistically now. We're not hyper-focused on this very hypothetical potential for fracture anymore. Okay? The final thoughts here. It definitely goes without saying that a built-up box is more redundant than a welded box. Now, I chose my words carefully there. It is not less likely to fracture. Built-up boxes, we have the data to show that we've been building very fracture-resistant welded members, welded girders, welded boxes since 1978. The data's there. The likelihood of fracture in a welded fabricated member is incredibly low. Okay, but again, we got to kind of go with some hypotheticals here. It is more redundant if something were to happen. Faulted state strength capacity calculations. So that state where we assume that one of the cover plates breaks and then we calculate strength, those are incredibly conservative. There's some more research ongoing at Purdue right now, and what they're finding is that even with a severed cover plate, and I don't want to steal thunder here, so I won't give any specifics, you can reach very high moments in those sections. It's almost as if the fracture isn't even there. It's incredible. The adjacent members act like splices. So that's good. We'll be able to take advantage of that later. Special inspection intervals are very conservative. So again, I mentioned that we base the special inspection interval on the faulted condition fatigue life, which is based on very conservative calculations. We use a 95% confidence interval for fatigue calculations. That means we have less than 2.5% chance of being wrong, which is really good. We have a factor of safety of 2 on top of that, okay? And then the fracture propagation itself is incredibly unlikely. Built-up members, inherently, when they start to fatigue crack, they don't propagate in brittle fracture almost ever. And the full-scale experimentations we did in the laboratory showed that it's incredibly difficult to get these things to fracture brittly. Okay, so what that means is when we assume an instantaneous brittle fracture one day, it's actually more likely to have a very slow-growing crack propagation that most likely will terminate in a bolted hole, actually, and be very safe. So it's conservative. Robust against overheight vehicle impacts, and POD we already talked about. So I was curious, Chuck, what do you think? Chuck approves. Thank you, Chuck. So with that, I think I'm at my time limit. So maybe we'll delay questions.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.